Let me welcome you to this afternoon's LaFollette Lecture. Welcome first to members of the Board of Trustees, to President and Laura Hess, our faculty, students, and honored guests. A very special welcome to Gary LaFollette and his wife, Sue, who have joined us this afternoon. Gary's joined us for most of these lectures. Thank you for continuing the legacy of your father and your family. For those of you who are new to the college or attending the lecture for the first time, this annual event is named in honor of Charles D. LaFollette, a graduate of Wabash College and member of the Board of Trustees from 1952 to 1977. We date the first lecture back to 1977, when the Humanities Division planned a dinner and formal lecture given by Distinguished Professor of English Bert Stern, to honor the lifelong commitment of Mr. LaFollette to the liberal arts and the humanities in particular. Leif LaFollette, as he was known, and his wife, Ibby, generously endowed the Distinguished Professor of Humanities chair as a way to recognize that, quote, the one indispensable asset and continuing requirement of a good college is superior teaching, end quote. At the time of Mr. LaFollette's death in 1982, the Board of Trustees established this annual LaFollette Lecture given by a Wabash College faculty member who is charged to address the relation of his or her special discipline to the humanities broadly conceived. I hope that after the lecture, you will join us for the reception just outside in the Tel lobby. And let me also ask, take a moment and please turn off the ringers on your electronic devices so that we can enjoy the lecture. It's become tradition to have the lecturer from the previous year introduce this year's speaker. So normally, I would turn the podium at this point over to Professor Brian Tucker, our LaFollette lecturer from 2017. But Brian and his family are spending his sabbatical year in the island nation of Plow, where Brian is working on a new monograph, while his wife Danielle is serving as visiting senior court counsel for the Palauan Supreme Court. I'm sorry to say, I couldn't persuade Brian to leave the tropical Pacific, no matter how beautiful it is, and come home here to Indiana. He did, however, send me his introduction. So, this is Brian's introduction. It's never easy to introduce someone who needs no introduction. At Wabash, that's Joyce Burnette, a long-serving and highly respected member of the faculty and the current chair of Division III. But even if Joyce Burnette doesn't require an introduction, her LaFollette lecture today provides a welcome occasion to remind ourselves of her wide-ranging interests and accomplishments. Joyce came to Wabash in 1996 after earning her PhD in economics from Northwestern University and holding visiting positions at Loyola University and Valparaiso University. She works primarily as an economic historian, and her research focuses on the role of women in the labor market. Her list of academic publications is long and impressive, too long to do justice in a brief introduction. Just reading through all the article titles would consume most of the time we have this afternoon. But Joyce's publications give us a better sense of her areas of specialization. She's often working on the 19th century, on the period of the Industrial Revolution, and often with British historical documents. Her articles treat topics such as occupational crowding, occupational segregation, the wage gap, and labor market discrimination. Joyce has promised to tell us today what economics has to say about culture, and if her CV is any guide, this is a question she has been successfully exploring for many years now. An achievement that deserves special mention is her book, Gender, Work, and Wages in Industrial Revolution Britain, which appeared with Cambridge University Press in 2008. In Joyce's words, the book argues that, quote, since strength was important in many occupations during the Industrial Revolution, lower wages for women do not necessarily imply discrimination, end quote. In the words of a reviewer, quote, Burnette's book contributes a great deal to debates about women workers and industrialization. Her arguments stand on impressive empirical foundations, and she is systematic and clear in presenting them, end quote. Writing at the intersection of gender and economic history, Joyce wades into a contentious debate and goes where the data take her. Her book provides a fresh perspective on how labor markets functioned in the 19th century and how they sorted women into particular occupations. In a cultural moment when we're still grappling with wage gaps and gender-based discrimination in the workplace, when the hashtag #MeToo movement has made us more alert to the barriers and harassment that women continue to face, Joyce's research strikes me as both historically grounded and remarkably relevant to contemporary issues. By examining how gendered occupational segregation or wage differences come about, her scholarship offers a different model for how we might frame and investigate similar questions today. By the way, the review of Joyce's book that I cited appeared in the Journal of Interdisciplinary History, a fitting venue to discuss a project that brings together so many different fields of inquiry, economics, of course, but also cultural history and gender studies, among others. The interdisciplinary nature of Joyce's monograph reflects the interdisciplinary nature of much of her academic work, in both her research and her teaching. Because she does economic history, many of her economics courses are cross-listed with history, and she has on several occasions team-taught a course on economic and political development. Joyce is a natural for this multidisciplinary sort of teaching, and an inspired choice for the LaFollette Lecture, precisely because she brings an economist's approach to thorny questions of history and gender. When she's not teaching labor economics to Wabash students or poring over agricultural records from 19th century Europe, she likes to spend her time doing labor of a different sort in the garden and the kitchen. Joyce's hobbies include cooking and gardening because, as she will tell you, she's a fan of local food. She's someone who appreciates the value of small-town life, of being able to walk to work and participating in the local community. In fact, Joyce is so committed to civic life in Crawfordsville that she ran for city council in 2015. Joyce is joined this afternoon by her husband, Patrick. Her son, Rand, couldn't make it today as he is away at college in his sophomore year at Kenyon. Now to the main attraction. Joyce's lecture will ask us to consider the question, what does economics have to say about culture? Brian concludes, I'm sorry that I don't get to hear the talk in person, but I send my applause from afar. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Joyce Burnette.
Thank you to Cheryl and to Brian for that introduction. I am pleased and honored to be chosen as the 39th LaFollette Lecturer. I am particularly honored to be the first economist to give this lecture, given the many excellent economists who have preceded me and who are currently at Wabash. Perhaps the fact that I am the first economist to be chosen has something to do with the subject of this lecture, the somewhat rocky relationship between economics and the humanities. The LaFollette Lecturer is charged to address the relationship of his or her special discipline to the humanities broadly conceived. As I reflected on this charge, I had to admit that the relationship between economics and humanities has not always been good. However, I think the relationship has improved substantially since I was in graduate school, and we are at least going in the right direction. As an economic historian, I have spent my academic career at the border of two disciplines. Even within the field of economic history, there's a clear divide between economics and history. The Economic History Association is dominated by economists. Maybe 10% of attendees are from history departments, and they have a breakfast in the morning on Saturday morning. The Social Science History Association is supposed to bridge these divides by bringing many different disciplines together, but in fact, economists and historians rarely attend the same sessions. So what is the origin of this rift, and can it be mended? I will focus on the divide between economics and history because that is where I have spent my career. I think the rift is a bit broader, but I want to focus on my own experience. I will examine the origins of the divide and recent developments that have brought the two closer together. I will then examine how culture and economics are inseparable. So first, I will discuss two reasons for the rift between economics and history, each of which is probably sufficient in itself: differences in subject and differences in method. Turning first to differences in subject. When studying what seems to be the same topic, such as women's work in the past, economists and historians tend to ask different questions. Economists usually ask, well, what did people do, and why did they act that way? And historians are more likely to ask, well, how do people think, and why do they think that way? The first question is about what people actually do. What work did they do? How were they paid? How many children did they have? And the second question is more about how we understand what we do and how we represent it to ourselves and others. For example, we can identify Davidoff and Hall as historians when they note that the suitability of field work, indeed any outdoor work for women, is almost always discussed in moral terms. Their book focuses on how people thought about work rather than the work itself. My own research does the opposite. I focus on what people did and not how they thought about it. What we do and how we think about what we do are not the same thing. Sometimes people act in a way that contradicts their expressed values. Here's an example. In 1876, an English employer, Frederick Carver, was being questioned by a parliamentary committee about women's employment. He claimed that we have, as a rule, an objection to employing married women because we think that every man ought to maintain his wife without the necessity of her going to work. But at the same time, he told the committee, as to married women, in one particular department of our establishment, we have 49 married women, and we wish that the present state of things as regard to married women should not be disturbed. Frederick seemed to have no problem saying one thing and then doing the opposite. Historians know this. In a classic paper, Amanda Vickery noted that we should not try to infer behavior from what we read in advice manuals. Just because a volume of domestic advice sits on a woman's desk, it does not follow that she took its strictures to heart, or whatever her intentions, managed to live her life according to its precepts. Thus, economics and history simply pursue different paths of study. Neither question is better or worse, they're just different questions. That's why we have different disciplines, because we're asking different questions about our world. Unfortunately, economists have often contributed to the rift between the disciplines by downplaying the importance of the second question and saying that culture matters less than actions. Karl Marx dismissed culture as superstructure that simply provides an excuse for actions that are driven by greed. Very non-Marxist economists generally had the same attitudes towards culture. It's secondary. When I was in graduate school, relying on culture as an explanation for behavior was seen as admitting failure. If you can't figure out an explanation for why a group of people act in a certain way, then call it culture. Generally, the assumption was that there is always an economic explanation, so if you call something cultural, it's because you failed to find the reason. Economists assume behavior is determined by utility maximization. While sometimes this is taken to mean that people act in a self-interested manner, that's not what it means. Utility maximization is perfectly consistent with altruism. Mother Teresa was no threat to our assumption. Okay? Recent studies have shown that human behavior is not actually always rational, but I will not venture down that side path. So a generation ago, economists combined utility maximization with this assumption that utility, or what people want, is fundamentally the same across cultures. Differences in behavior then were driven by different constraints and opportunities that people faced. Prices drive behavior. For a statement of this position, I turn to a 1977 paper by two Nobel Prize winning economists, George Stigler and Gary Becker. Their position is that all differences in behavior can be explained by the constraints people face. They contrast this with other economists who think that some differences in behavior can be explained by culture. On the traditional view, an explanation of economic phenomena that reaches a difference in taste between people or times is the terminus of the argument. The problem is abandoned at this point to whoever studies and explains tastes: psychologists, anthropologists, phrenologists, sociobiologists. Notice that they admit the possibility that other disciplines might study the formation of taste, but they mock such a study by linking it to phrenologists and sociobiologists. Instead of this traditional view, Stigler and Becker urge economists to push further and explain all phenomena without appealing to differences in tastes. On our preferred interpretation, no one reaches this impasse. The economist continues to search for differences in prices or incomes that explain any differences or changes in behavior. Stigler and Becker propose that widespread and/or persistent human behavior can be explained by a generalized calculus of utility maximizing behavior without the introduction of the qualification tastes remain the same. In other words, they suggest that tastes don't matter. People are fundamentally the same, and there's no room for culture as an explanation. Culture only seems to matter because people in different countries face different institutions and prices. Unsurprisingly, this view did not endear economists to scholars in the humanities who were more interested in why people think the way they do. But that is not the only reason for the rift. Economists and historians have also been divided by their methods. Economists who want to study what people do have little interest in what they say for the reasons just given and instead measure what they do. One action might be atypical. We need many observations of action, which are called data. Historians who want to study how people think are more interested in what they say and need to devote a great deal of time to close reading to understand one text. This difference in method ought to be fine, since we're pursuing different questions, but generally we don't trust each other's methods. Economists don't trust individual examples, which we call anecdotes. In graduate school, I saw papers criticized for using anecdotes as evidence. Senior economists noted that the economist always asks, how typical, how often? My advisor was quick to point out that the plural of anecdote is data, but that's sort of the point. You need more than one observation to have reliable evidence. Some people, however, don't like numbers, and they claim that they're way too cold to tell a human story. In fact, there's evidence that many people feel this way. Behavioral economists have studied how much you're willing to give to charity by paying subjects $5 in dollar bills and then giving them the opportunity to give any number of those dollars to a charity addressing the food crisis in Ethiopia. Subjects who were given the story of one individual with a picture, called the identifiable victim, gave more than subjects who were given statistics about the crisis, the statistical victim. So for most people, statistics do not have the immediacy of stories. Okay? This study also found that telling people ahead of time about this tendency made them less generous and not more generous. It reduced the response to the identifiable victim, but did not increase the response to the statistical victim. But I still think that this response results from a failure of imagination. So if numbers are cold and lifeless to you, maybe that reflects a lack of imagination on your part. Let's take the number 10, okay? Devoid of context, it means nothing. What is it? Is it the perfect 10, the age of your dog, the volume at which you like to listen to your music? I don't know, okay? But statistics are never, in fact, devoid of context. So now, suppose I give this number some context and tell you that the unemployment rate in October 2009 was 10%. Now that has meaning. That is a story of human tragedy, right? Does it still seem cold and lifeless to you? You might have to bring some knowledge of your own to see the meaning. Knowing the definition of employment, we know this means that 1 in every 10 people who want to work are not able to find work. Knowledge that in American society, your social identity and status is connected to your occupation tells you that those without an occupation feel they have no value. We might add that the knowledge that for every 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate, 214 people commit suicide. Or that each 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate is associated with a 0.7% percentage point increase in the poverty rate, so that compared to normal unemployment, like 5%, at 10% unemployment, an additional 3.5% of the population live in poverty. Suddenly, it's not just a number, but a story. And if you spend enough time with numbers, they are stories. A more fundamental objection to quantitative analysis is that data is not objective, but is itself a cultural product. Okay? A good example of this is census data from the past. If you're looking for evidence of women's work in the past, the censuses seem like a good place to look for data because they list everybody's occupation, but it turns out they're not. Occupational designations in the census tell us more about how people thought about work than about the work they actually did. The cultural expectation was that women didn't work, so the censuses generally did not record them as working. The instructions for the 1841 census state that women working in family businesses but not receiving wages should not be listed as having an occupation. Numerous historical studies have demonstrated that women who were paid for work, as evidenced by payments in the employer's accounts, are listed in the census as having no occupation. Clearly, census data is not an accurate measure of women's work. I've seen a number of economic historians, usually ones trained as economists, tempted to use census data to measure female labor force participation, only to be shot down at conferences by people who pay attention to the data and know better. But this is no reason to abandon data any more than it is a reason to abandon textual evidence, which also sometimes lies to us. It just means that we need to handle the data with care and understand its biases. Quantitative evidence can be good or bad, just as close reading can be good or bad. Another reason that some historians don't like numbers is that some questions cannot be answered with statistics. Statistics can't tell you anything about individuals, only about averages. Individuals have free will, and individual behavior can't be predicted. But if we have a large enough sample, the law of large numbers kicks in, and we can do a pretty good job of predicting the average. For example, if the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, I know that fewer Americans will buy a car. I know that. But that tells me absolutely nothing about whether you will buy a car this year. Some historical questions are about individual behavior, and statistics are not helpful. For example, why did John Wilkes Booth shoot Abraham Lincoln? This event happened once, I cannot use statistics to study it. Other questions are about groups. For example, how does fertility change when female education goes up? Here, statistics can help because we can rely on the law of large numbers. So again, it comes back to the question being asked. Economists are more likely to use statistics because they're more likely to ask questions that are well suited to statistical analysis. So economists usually use statistics, and historians are more likely to use close reading and thick description, which is better. Sometimes the choice of methodology is set up like that. For example, this book, Which Road to the Past? Two Views of History, by the economist Robert Fogel and the historian Jeffrey Elton. While in fact both authors acknowledge the value of the other approach, the book is set up like a debate, as if you had to pick one. Which road to the past? Well, do they really expect us to pick one? To me, that's a little bit like saying, which utensil would you like for dinner tonight, a fork or a spoon? How would you answer that? Like, well, I don't know, what are we having? Soup? Steak? Hey, why do I have to choose anyway? So we have the obvious answer, I would like to use both. Or at least I would like to have the option to use whichever one I want, depending on the question I'm researching. Both are valuable tools in the toolkit, and which is better depends on the situation. When I entered the profession, the relationship between economics and history was not very good. Economists ignored and disparaged culture, casting culture as the explanation used by people who can't figure out the real explanation. Historians ignored or disparaged numbers, casting economic analysis as a celebration of selfishness. Each side distrusted each other's questions and methods. Can this rift be mended? Yes, and in fact, it already has been, at least to some extent. Over my career, I have seen convergence in both subject and method. In terms of subject matter, culture has become an acceptable topic of inquiry in economics, if still not the favored explanation for behavior. In methodology, the humanities have discovered the value of statistics. So, first, subject. It has been 4 decades since Stigler and Becker asserted that everything can be explained by utility maximization without reference to differences in taste. 20 years after that, economists were questioning these claims. In 1997, Peter Temin used his presidential address at the Economic History Association to broach the topic. His title, "Is it kosher to talk about culture?" is phrased as a question, suggesting some uncertainty about the answer. Temin discussed the economic implications of British, American, and Japanese cultures for growth, and cited 3 papers discussing culture that had appeared in the previous 3 years. Neither Stigler nor Becker showed up to scold him, but still it seemed somehow risky and innovative at the time. Today, there's no question that culture is an acceptable topic in economics, and economics no longer apologize for talking about it. In 2015, the American Economics Review contained 3 articles using the word culture, and 3 more including the words values or beliefs. Here are some examples of economics papers that take culture seriously. Some papers have even studied, yes, believe it or not, what people say. So here's an example which we'll come back to later. Alberto Elizina, Paola Giuliano, and Nathan Nunn examined the determinants not only of female labor force participation, but also of whether people say they agree with the statements, when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women, and on the whole, men make better political leaders than women do. Economics has changed a lot in the 29 years I've been a part of it. In terms of methods, there's definitely been an increase in the use of statistics, not only in history, but also in the humanities more broadly. Some historians are using quantitative methods. Examples are Anne McCants at MIT and Jane Whittle at the University of Exeter. The field of digital humanities has brought us, among other things, the statistical analysis of text. In what is said to be the first paper in the field, Frederick Mosteller and David Wallace in 1963 used word counts to determine the authorship of 12 disputed Federalist papers. Using text known to be authored by Hamilton or Madison, they identified words that were used more commonly by one author. For example, Madison uses by more often than Hamilton, and Hamilton uses upon more often than Madison. Mosteller and Wallace identified 20 words used differently by the two authors and assigned them weights. Summing the words in the paper multiplied by the weights, they obtained scores for each paper. Positive weights mean Hamilton uses the word more. So since most of the scores are negative, they conclude that the disputed papers were written by Madison, with the possible exception of paper number 55, which has a positive score there. Since this beginning, the statistical analysis of text has grown and is now used fairly widely. Historians have used statistics to analyze texts. In a project led by Maria Ågren at Uppsala University, Swedish historians have read documents from the period 1550 to 1800, including court records and diaries, and have pulled out the verb phrases describing what people did. They created a data set of 16,182 verb phrases, each connected to an individual. So using that, they can compare what work men and women did. They find that both men and women were engaged in a broad range of economic activity, both in and outside of the home, and yes, men even engaged in childcare. Out of this work came the idea of the two-supporter model, which they think is a better description of pre-industrial families than the male breadwinner model. Last year, the analysis of text was used to reveal sexism in the economics profession. Alice Wu, who was then still a graduate student, took posts from the American Economic Association website, Job Market Rumors. Using computer analysis, she identified whether the post was discussing a man or a woman by looking for words such as he or she, and then looked for the most common words associated with men and women. Here's what she found. This table caused a stir in the economics profession. I'm not going to read it for you. You got to read it. In an effort to rein in sexism in our profession, Michael Reich and Heidi Hartman circulated the petition asking for the American Economic Association to create an alternative website for sharing job market data that is not anonymous. So it turns out that statistics can help us analyze not only what people do, but also how they think. If Alice Wu had surveyed people and asked them whether they treated male and female candidates equally, everyone would have said, yes, of course we do. Statistics helped her to get a better answer to that question. So if we can just learn to trust each other's methodologies, perhaps economic historians from both disciplines can feel more like co-workers with different specialties and less like rivals. I think we can mend the rift between economic and history if we do two things. First, respect each other's methods. Maybe use them or maybe not. I'm not asking anyone to eat their soup with a fork, but respect them. And second, recognize that our questions are more closely linked than we thought. So to illustrate this last point, I will look more closely at the links between economics and culture. So in spite of the rejection of culture by George Stigler and Gary Becker, it turns out that culture and economics actually aren't separable. They're too closely intertwined for us to be able to ignore either one when looking at the other. How people think affects what they do, and what they do affects how they think. In the second half of this lecture, I'll look at some recent research on two questions. First, does culture affect what we do? And second, where do cultural norms come from? First, does culture affect what we do? Yes, it does. Using quantitative methods, economists have demonstrated that culture often does affect action. I'll give you 3 examples. The first example asks, do the gender norms of your culture affect your actions? So Marianne Bertrand, Emir Kamenika, and Jessica Pan examined the cultural expectation that a husband earns more than his wife. In 1995, 38% of US respondents agreed with the statement, if a woman earns more money than her husband, it's almost certain to cause problems. So that's a minority, but it still affects action. Of course, we know that many couples do not follow the norm. In fact, in 27% of couples, the wife actually earns more. So how are women affected by this cultural norm? Wives whose earning potential is more than their husbands often avoid this situation by working less. They are less likely to be in the labor force, and if they do work, they're more likely to be working part-time. Couples where the wife earns more are more likely to get a divorce. Women who earn more than their husband do more housework. The authors conclude that once a wife earns more than her husband, she starts to compensate for it by spending more time on chores and childcare. Gender norms are not deterministic, but they do change some people's behavior. The second example asks, do the gender roles that your parents teach you affect your actions? We can study this question separately from the culture in which you live by examining the actions of women born in the US who are children of immigrants. Raquel Fernandez and Alessandra Fogli do exactly this. They use the 1970 census to examine the work and fertility behavior of US-born women who had immigrant fathers. Since all their women were in the study were born in the US, they all lived in the same culture and to a large extent had the same opportunities. However, what they learned at home may differ. Fernandez and Fogli find that the behavior of these women was correlated with the 1950 labor force participation and fertility rates in the father's country of birth. So there's a table. Higher labor force participation in the father's country of origin, labeled in the table female LFP 1950, was positively correlated with higher hours of work per week among their daughters. Higher fertility rates in the father's country of origin, labeled TFR 1950, were associated with higher fertility rates among their US-born daughters. Evidently, US-born daughters were influenced by what they learned from their parents. The third example gets to the heart of Stigger and Becker's claim. Are preferences universal, or are they learned behavior that differs by culture? Specifically, we ask, are gender differences in competitiveness cultural or biological? To understand this, first we need a bit of context. Studies of the US population have determined that men are more likely to choose competition than women. Muriel Niederle and Lise Westerlund paid subjects for adding columns of numbers by hand. When they gave subjects a choice of whether to be paid a piece rate, or 50 cents for every correct sum, or by a tournament where they got $2 for every correct sum, but only if they had more correct answers than the other 3 people in their row. Okay. Given this choice, they found that 73% of men chose the tournament compared to 35% of women. The paper concludes that they don't know whether this gender difference was due to cultural training or to biological differences. So are differences in competitiveness caused by nature or nurture? A different group of behavioral economists did a similar study with people from 2 very different cultures. So Neasy, Leonard, and List paid subjects for tossing a tennis ball in a basket and let them choose to be paid either a fixed fee for each ball that they tossed in the basket, or as a tournament, in which case they got paid 3 times as much, but only if they outperformed a peer, only if they won. The authors did this experiment with 2 different societies. one patriarchal society, the Maasai in Tanzania, and one matriarchal society, the Khasi in India. In the patriarchal society, the men were more likely to choose the tournament. 50% of men and only 26% of women chose the tournament. However, in the matriarchal society, 54% of the women and only 39% of the men chose the tournament. Thus, it seems that the relationship between gender and competitiveness is a function of the culture in which you grew up. So we have quantitative evidence that culture affects your behavior and even your preferences. Economists have fairly well rejected the claim by Stigler and Becker that we can safely ignore differences in tastes. But economists have not left it there. They have also asked another question. Question 2, where do cultural norms come from? In the past, economists had nothing to say about where culture comes from. Discussing gender discrimination in 1976, Kenneth Arrow wrote that it may not be totally surprising that economic theories have nothing to say about the causes of racial, sexual, or national differences. It is true that economic theories can say something about the effects. Given that you have sexual discrimination or national identity, they are not in a position to explain why the phenomena occurred in the first place. So economists of the previous generation expressed no opinion on where gender discrimination came from. Generally, they didn't care anyway. In the past few decades, this has changed. A number of papers have tried to demonstrate that gender roles have their roots in economic reality. In their explanation of cultural norms, economists have shown two things. One, economic incentives shape social preferences. And two, social preferences are persistent. To illustrate this, we will look at the extent of sun preference in China. First, the metric. As Amartya Sen pointed out many years ago, there are about 100 million missing women. The number of girls born is approximately equal to the number of boys born, not exactly equal. As students who have taken Div 3 252 will know, approximately 105 boys are born for every 100 girls. However, population censuses reveal that in some countries, boys are more overrepresented than this. Among children under 15, China has 1.17 boys for every girl, while in the US there are 1.04 boys for every girl. What happened to the missing girls? Today, differential abortion explains some of the skewed sex ratio, but it is only recently that sex could be determined before birth. Before the ultrasound, a skewed sex ratio was due to differences in attention paid to baby boys and girls. Where boys were considered more important than girls, they got more care and more resources and were more likely to survive. Thus, the sex ratio is a measure of how much a society values boys relative to girls. So what does that have to do with the price of tea in China? Well, quite a lot, it turns out. In 1978, yeah, now you get it. In 1978 to 1980, China introduced reforms that increased the income a family would receive from cash crops like tea and fruit. Since tea is usually picked by women, an increase in the price of tea makes women more valuable than does an increase in the price of fruit. So Nancy Chien measured changes in the sex ratio in tea growing and fruit growing areas when the reforms were introduced. She found that in tea growing areas, but not fruit growing areas, the sex ratio improved, meaning that more girls survived. In this graph, we see that the two regions were similar before the reform, but after the reform, the fruit-growing regions continued to have an excess of boys, while the excess of boys declined in the tea-growing regions, the regions where the price of tea increased and women became more valuable. Such preferences are also persistent, outlasting the economic incentives on which they were based. To demonstrate this, we switch to another paper which also uses the sex ratio in China to measure preferences. The economic incentive is different, though. This time we examine textile production, which had a high demand for female labor. Melanie Zhu identified areas of China that had more cotton weaving in the pre-industrial period and showed that these regions have more equal sex ratios today. In the table, we see a negative correlation between the presence of the pre-modern cotton textile industry and the current sex ratio, meaning that those regions have relatively more girls today. In regions of historical textile production, residents today are less likely to express opinions of male superiority. They also have fewer widow suicides and more female-headed households. This in spite of the fact that cotton weaving is no longer an important determinant of the demand for female labor. So here's another example of persistence, this time a little bit farther back. In agricultural societies using the plow, women have generally participated less in agriculture than in regions using the hoe. This makes economic sense because the plow requires more strength. So Alizina, Giuliano, and Nunn show that regions of the world more suitable for the plow not only had lower female labor force participation in agriculture in the past, but also today have lower female labor force participation and lower female business ownership. These different actions are accompanied by different thoughts as well. In surveys from people in the plow regions, are more likely to agree with the statement, when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women. Since hardly anyone uses the plow today, the economic rationale for the difference has disappeared. So why the persistence? The author suggests that the effects are persistent because gender roles are passed down from parents to children. Exploring this persistence more deeply, Giuliano and Nunn ask if persistence varies across cultures. They hypothesize that a culture should be more persistent in societies where circumstances change less from generation to generation, and less persistent in cultures where circumstances change more. If your parents actually know what they're talking about, then it pays to listen to them. So to test this, Giuliano and Nunn examine the relationship between stable environments and persistent behavior. So to measure the stability of the environment, they used temperature variability, specifically using data on temperatures between the years 500 and 1900 for various regions. They calculated average temperatures over 20-year periods, and then took the variability of those averages over the whole period 500 to 1900. Some regions have more temperature variability than others. On the map, the dark regions have more temperature variability. To measure cultural persistence, then, they looked at changes over time in 3 measurable variables: female labor force participation, polygamy, and consanguineous marriage. They then related those changes in those behaviors over time to the region where your ancestors came from. They find that people from regions with stable climates have more persistence over their time in their behavior, while people from regions with less stable climates have less persistence in their behavior. Their conclusion: you pay more attention to your parents when you live in a stable environment. So I've told you that cultural roles have economic origins, but that culture is persistent and affects behavior. Doesn't that make things circular? Oh, I skipped one. There we go. If culture determines behavior, how do actions change and create new cultures? The answer, of course, is that none of these relationships are deterministic. Yes, your culture affects the probability that you will work for pay or choose competition, but so do your individual circumstances and even your own choices. Culture influences what you do, but it does not determine it. When economists do find persistent effects, those effects are often quite small. While the use of the plow in the past matters, it explains only 6% of the variation in female labor force participation today. In China, pre-modern cotton production explains only 15% of variation in the sex ratio in 2000, and only 3 to 5% of the variation in stated gender values. That leaves the vast majority of attitudes and actions to be determined by other factors, which could be other cultural influences, current economic incentives, or simply individual choice. We can identify some situations where culture has less effect than normal. So, in the last study I'll discuss, Nico Voigtlander and Hans-Joachim Voth found that, in general, regional variation in anti-Semitism in Germany is persistent over the 600 years between the Black Death and the Nazis. Towns that had pogroms in 1349 had higher votes for the Nazi Party in 1928. However, exposure to trade made the relationship weaker. In cities where the Hanseatic League engaged in international trade, anti-Semitism was less persistent over time. Exposure to people from other cultures, in this case, tended to break down prejudice. So that's good news. While culture influences your behavior, it does not entirely determine it. There's also good news for economics and history. While in the past, economics and the humanities have not gotten along very well, separated by their differences in subject and method, more recently the rift is healing. There's been some convergence in subject and method. Of course, the convergence will never be complete. Different disciplines will always ask different questions and use different methods. However, there need be no large rift between the economics and the humanities if we can see each other as complementary methods of understanding human nature and not as substitutes. We all have the same overarching goal: to understand human behavior. All that remains is for us to respect each other's focus and methods. Thank you.